Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Why Such a Fast podcast. Annie Mcneely, an ISO 9001 practitioner, is with us today to talk about risk management. Annie, why is risk management important in the ISO 9001 standard?
Okay, so in a previous podcast or two, I've mentioned the 7 principles of quality management. And whilst risk management isn't one of those specific quality management principles, it's an important principle for any business of any size, of any activity, and it covers all the activities in the business. So even if they're not quality certified, risk management is an important thing for any business. So I would always make that point first. In the context of ISO, what you're trying to achieve and constantly improve on is customer satisfaction, ultimately. And so risks that go unmanaged have the potential to severely impact and negatively impact your customer satisfaction. And for that reason, the ISO 9001 standard places a lot of emphasis on managing risks. So whilst it's not a quality specific thing, it is important because it impacts quality and therefore impacts your customers. As I've mentioned before, the standard isn't usually very prescriptive about how you go about doing or meeting the various requirements in it. But when it comes to risk management, it is slightly more prescriptive insofar as it makes it very clear that you must, first off, identify and record and then plan to manage risks. And usually that will manifest itself in a quality management system along the lines of a risk register where the risks are recorded, they're ranked, and then an auditor will expect to see some form of identifiable plan for managing those risks. It could be an action plan. Could be a project plan. It could come through as all sorts of things. But the key thing is to be able to show that you are aware of the risks, you understood the severity of them, the likelihood of them, and that you are taking action to address them. Now, you could, where do you draw the line, right? Because you could have risk after risk after risk after risk. I usually tell my clients, for the purposes of their quality management system, to bear in mind this idea that if it affects quality, it affects your customer. And so the risks that you need to focus on are the ones that are likely to have those effects. And yeah, beyond that, it really comes down to common sense and the knowledge of your business and knowledge of your customers. And there will be risks that you are aware of that have potential to really impact your customers, but which you can't necessarily fix. They're bigger than you and your organization. That doesn't mean you ignore them. It means you can monitor them. You have a contingency plan in place if that risk should escalate. So that you don't sort of throw your hands up in despair and say, well, there's nothing we can do about that. There are things you can do. You can't necessarily cut it out of the picture, but you can be ready for it and ready to act. So if you bear in mind that principle of if it affects quality, it therefore affects our customer, and those are the things we need to focus on, you can't go too far wrong, really, when it comes to risk management in an ISO context.
Yeah, no, thank you, Annie. And it's sort of carry on with the theme of elements that are both in the ISO 9001 and the GDPR. Well, risk is one of them, and it does feature in GDPR. And the regulation does promote a risk-based approach. And interestingly enough, the regulation is interested in the risk to the individuals in terms of the risk to their rights and freedom, rather than the risk to the organization. However, it does put an obligation to any organization to carry out risk assessment, in particularly when introducing a change, such as a new process, a new system of software, new technology, if they are starting collecting biometric data like fingerprints, and things of this nature. And the reason for that is because obviously any change carries a risk, as we mentioned in one of our previous podcasts on change management. And so the regulation is interested in making sure that whatever the change is does not have an impact, a negative impact to the individual, to their rights and freedom. And so it sort of asks the organization to do a risk assessment, for example, when transferring data to countries that do not have an adequacy status. And again, to ensure that if there is a risk and it's of a high level, there are safeguards or mitigation, put in place. It also goes so far and asking organization to carry out an assessment when they choose legitimate interest as their lawful basis for processing data. And this is to ensure that the organization interests do not supersede those of the individual. Because again, if we go back to the purpose of the GDPR, is about protecting individuals from coming to harm through the use of their personal data. Now, it would be really silly of an organization to carry out a risk assessment, risk management, just from the individual perspective. I think it's important to also do one from the organization perspective, because any organization faces risk, as you've quite eloquently, Annie, put it, in regard to quality, but also in regards to other aspects of the organization. And so it's important that they are captured, they are assessed, they are managed correctly. So whenever I work with a client, I always implement a risk management strategy as the foundation to build on. And when we go and identify risk, we look at the entire business. We don't just look at it from a GDPR perspective. So we look at and consider risk from a personal perspective, governmental risk. We look at commercial risk, perception risk, such as whether there are situations of racially, gender offensive type of risk, security risk, again, not just from a data perspective, but also financial risk, legal risk, such as health and safety, or not being GDPR compliant as an overall risk. Things that which will then damage the organization reputation, and in some cases, even beyond repair. We also look at operational risks, commercial risk, technical and environmental. Well, if you think of COVID, any organization, big or small, as you said, should be looking at their risk. And if they had a proper risk management framework in place, they would have captured the risk of a pandemic and identified mitigation strategies to cope with that, so that when COVID hit, they would have been better prepared, and potentially more businesses will still be running today. A business should look holistically at the overall organization, not just on the risk to the individual, but also, like you say, quality, and then commercially, financially, operationally, etc., etc. So the moral of the story really is that it's really important to have a risk management as part of your operation, as part of embedded in your organization, and that sort of use a pragmatic, a realistic, and also holistic approach to the business.
Holistic is the key word, I think.
Yes.
And I think it's you mentioned change management there. I think often the change is the one area where the risk element sometimes is overlooked, because all the focus is on the change and the benefits of the change and the investment and the people side and so on. But any significant change has a massive element of risk within it. And understanding the sort of law of unintended consequences when it comes to change is really important, and understanding that whilst you might be changing that thing in that department, which is a benefit, there could be risks to other areas of your business, and you have to sort of extrapolate out and make sure that all of those are considered and managed as part of that change.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's change is a big area where risk can kick in.
Yes,
and it needs to be part of it.
And we go back to another episode we talked about, a process-driven approach where, having all of your processes documented will help you to identify if you make a change in one place, what are the potential repercussion to another process or another steps further down the line within that process, and that basically it's your risk. So it all interchange, doesn't it?
It does. In fairness, it is all interrelated. That's absolutely true. Yeah.
Annie, thank you very much for your time today. Could you let our audience know how they could get in touch with you should they wish to contact you?
Sure. So I can be found easily on LinkedIn under my name, Annie Mcneely. And my website is anniemcneely.co.uk. And if you'd like to email me, my email address is on my LinkedIn profile. So please do feel free to get in touch.
Fantastic. Thank you, Annie. And if any of our audience would like to get in touch with me to understand a bit more about GDPR, then I can be reached at info@cvgsolutions.co.uk. Alternatively, you can find me on social media, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram, or through our website, cvgsolutions.co.uk. Thank you very much for listening.